What's in a riff? I didn't grow up with Black Sabbath, but I certainly knew their riffs. They were ubiquitous, heard in garage band rehearsals, on the schoolyard, in pop culture. The first Tony Iommi creation that I ever heard was sung by the titular characters of the Beavis and Butthead show. In fact, I still hear Sabbath riffs today. How many of us were watching the Blue Jays in the World Series recently? Do you remember hearing this riff between pitches? I was watching the game with my daughters, and they were always confused when after hearing this, I would lean over and whisper, "I am Iron Man." What's in a riff? Today, when we hear a popular song, we probably hear a hook through the back drum beat, or perhaps in a beautiful vocal melody. The heavy metal era leaned into the idea that a guitar riff can be a gateway to specific moods and aesthetics. The riff can be the hook of the song. Where Black Sabbath is concerned, the impact of their art comes not in the riff itself, but in the matter-of-fact way the poetry is delivered into the cognitive state created by the riff. Delivered into those gray spaces between emotions, between states of being, drawn out by those riffs. This past week, in addition to my Sabbath albums, I've been listening to a lot of my old grunge albums. There's a direct line of influence that runs from Birmingham to Seattle, from the roots of Black Sabbath to the roots of grunge rock. Hearing my favorite bands in the early 90s talk about Sabbath and Zeppelin and Deep Purple were all I needed to start my listening journey. Dave Grohl said when he heard the guitar riff in the Sabbath song Symptom of the Universe, it took him to an emotional state that made him a fan for life. Eddie Vedder received Sabbath's debut album on his 6th birthday. He recalls, "I heard that rain falling, and then this chord came in out of nowhere and scared the shit out of me." There's a reason for that. A reason these first impressions affect us so deeply and awaken the creative process. These riffs aren't just earworms, they're world building. They not only project a meditative state of specific emotions, but they transport us to a place inside ourselves. The place where we protect our most fragile truths. The place where questioning can begin. Let's set the record straight. Ozzy, Tony, Geezer, and Bill were not Satan worshippers looking to sow seeds of anarchy. They were 4 young musicians growing up in the financially depressed environment of the 1960s Birmingham. 4 friends who were tired of hearing that common command, shut up about the things you can't control, put on a smile, grab a factory job if you can get one, and keep your head down. They weren't lazy. They didn't want to just join the status quo as working stiffs. They didn't want to be phony. They just wanted to play music and be themselves. This is plain to hear in their debut album, which sounds more like a jam session than a series of radio-friendly recordings. When I was at Huron University College in London, Ontario, our then chaplain, Bill Cliff, hosted a weekly event entitled The Gospel According to the Simpsons, which included a viewing of the episode of a show, The Simpsons, and some group discussion afterwards. Naturally, with a crowd of mostly theology students at these events, Bill was questioned about his reasoning for the event in the first minute of the first session. Why elevate the status of this show that poked fun at the teachings of Jesus? He explained that while the characters were not always Christ-like in their actions, it was the only show on television that actually talked about God, about good and evil. I find it's much the same with Black Sabbath. We just heard in Into the Void, leave the earth to Satan and his slaves, leave them to their future in their graves. Make a home where love is there to stay, peace and happiness in every day. That may be a darker vision than we're used to discussing here, but Sabbath is grappling with a lot of the same struggles we find in the Gospels. Into the void, or perhaps into the kingdom of heaven. You may not believe in the devil, and I'm not convinced that Sabbath did either, but they certainly believed in good and evil, love and injustice. Music critic Lester Bangs famously called Sabbath the first truly Catholic rock group, the first group to completely immerse themselves in the fall and redemption. Bangs goes on to compare Sabbath to the likes of Bob Dylan and author William Burroughs in their use of art to question authority and call out injustice. In our scripture readings today, we are encouraged not only to call out injustice and evil, but to do so with conviction and energy. The day of reckoning for greed and corruption brought up in these readings is echoed in our songs tonight. Black Sabbath leaned into their imagery as Satan-worshipping occultists. They rarely corrected the assumptions and dark symbolism thrust on them by fans and critics. Yet their lyrics tell a different story. Gospel themes of love, individualism, inclusion, and standing up in the face of injustice are littered throughout their art. And where God is concerned, Sabbath often held perhaps the most Christian of all cognitive states: doubt. God is dead. God is dead? What a difference a question mark makes. Our scripture and our songs ask the question, if I stand up for what is right, will I be supported? Will I feel supported? In our gospel readings, as Jesus outlined the strife and ultimate deliverance of his followers, it's clear to me there would have been listeners that day scared off by the surface level mentions of coming war and destruction, and other listeners who would have heard a deeper message of hope and faith. Those critics of Black Sabbath who could get past the name, the clothing, the image, would eventually come to realize a similar message of hope. An interval in music is naming the space between two notes. There's a musical interval between two notes that takes on a special significance in Sabbath's music. It's called a tritone. This is what a perfect fourth sounds like. And this is what a perfect fifth sounds like. And in between those, this is what a tritone sounds like. Not quite as attractive sounding as its neighbors, right? It's long been legend that this interval was outlawed in medieval and Renaissance church music writing. Do you know what the nickname is for this interval? There you go. Devil in music, Diabolus in musica. The first track on the first album that the band released is sometimes referred to as the Unholy Trinity. The track, Black Sabbath, on the album Black Sabbath by the band Black Sabbath. This is the moment that 6-year-old Eddie Vedder was talking about. The record begins with the sounds of rain, thunder, and church bells. And eventually, we hear that first musical interval. It sounds like this. It's not quite that pure, perfect fifth, and it's not quite that devil's music tritone. It's a riff that wavers between dissonance and consonance, questioning and accepting, Satan and God. This is the message, encapsulated in one interval. Question the status quo. Question your own motives. Call out injustice. As our gospel put it, by your endurance will you gain your souls. Ultimately, the war pigs we grapple with may be within ourselves. Doubt and faith, inaction and conviction, apathy and love. Is God dead?